do.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Welcome back from the 4th of July holiday. I hope it was a good one for you, and I hope that your national pride is something that is, once again, fashionable. We made it through the month of June, and of course, there are plenty of reasons for us to be proud of being Americans. I also want to tip my hat to the Idaho Freedom Foundation for its Pride in America series that it ran throughout the month of June. And it's astonishing that the people can't look at the full historical record. And I'm talking about celebrating even controversial people, for instance, like Senator Joe McCarthy, and being able to recognize the role that they played. It seems like, we have to reject everything that came before us, everything that was bad, and therefore we can only embrace what is new, and apparently what our leftist overlords have in mind for us. Which brings me to our subject today. Today, we're going to be talking about converting us to California. Now, this has been going on since I was a kid growing up in Idaho. I have seen that, oh boy, here come the Californians to tell us how, the big city thinking goes and how we should all be thinking and behaving. Now, granted, there are some really good people who come to Idaho from California, mainly to get away from all of that leftist agenda. But there are others who come here, perhaps well-intended, but they're here to show us rubes, how things are supposed to be done. And that's a shame. But it comes through loud and clear in the way that our legacy media reports. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to share one thing real quick. I don't know if you experienced this strange cognitive dissonance at the parade yesterday, but Babylon Bee had the best headline of the week. Democrats confused by parades where everyone wears clothes and doesn't swing sex toys around. Now that I think of it, the 4th of July parade that I was attending in Paris, Idaho was lacking perversity, but I'm not saying it like that was necessarily a bad thing. It was actually kind of a neat affair. And for that, I'm very grateful. Let's talk about the obsession with education on the part of the left. And nobody is a higher, grand priest of the political left and leftist thinking, that California thinking, than former Attorney General Jim Jones. Right now, he's got serious beef with the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and in particular, on the subject of education. I have to wonder if this has to do with the idea that he and other people who are prone to statism, by which I mean that mindset that anything that's not under the direct control of the state is somehow, by definition, out of control. I wonder if they worry that somehow this means they won't be able to mold young minds early on and establish, a pattern of thought that embraces leftist ideology. Because it really feels that way when I hear some of the complaints. Now, Jim has a lot of bones to pick with education, and this piece that was published in today's Times News or magicvalley.com, oh boy, Idaho Freedom Foundation rolls out plan to destroy public education. By the way, just to irritate Jim and others who are prone to that particular brand of statism, I don't like to call it public education so much as refer to it as government education, because it is a government-run system. And for some reason, that kind of truth in advertising is offensive. It makes them upset that someone would speak truthfully. Kind of like Attorney General Raul Labrador has upset folks regarding the Open Primaries Initiative, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the program. So Jim Jones, in his opinion piece, says the Idaho Freedom Foundation has already shown us how to drive a storied community college to the brink of ruin. IFF board chair Brent Regan and his wrecking crew have just about finished off North Idaho College. Now, I don't know a ton about this other than we talked about it a little bit on a previous episode, but North Idaho College, it sounds like, was in the clutches of a very determined left-wing cabal. And somehow, or perhaps it was because of that left-wing cabal, there were some conservative board members elected. And now, it's all very fashionable to pretend that, well, they've destroyed the whole thing. What they've done is they have reined in the influence of those leftist ideologues, and this is what Jim, among others, finds intolerable. Now he says the IFF is demonstrating its plan to discredit and dismantle Idaho's public schools, starting with West Bonner County School District, centered in Priest River. Now, of course, he's talking about Brandon Durst. He says the IFF helped get far-right candidates Keith Rutledge and Susan Brown elected to the school board in November 2021, making a 3-trustee majority that has been creating havoc ever since. Now, maybe I'm just being a stickler here, but I'd kind of like Jim to flesh out, what exactly do you mean by creating havoc? Does that mean not rubber stamping every leftist wish list? Or is there something a little more substantive that you'd like to explain? He kind of leaves it to our emotional association to fill in the blanks. This is typical. The majority refused to support a $4.7 million 2-year levy that was intended to cover about a third of the West Bonner County School District's annual operating budget. Now, somehow Jim is reading something very sinister into this, but the bottom line is, if they're not using money efficiently, or if there is danger in taking on more debt at this time, wouldn't a reasonable person agree that they probably did the right thing? In other words, there could be reasons other than they're just trying to destroy our children's education or, the government-run school system in general. This is a hard thing for politicians to understand, but sometimes the word no is the appropriate word when it comes to, the question, may I have more money? Or I guess it's more appropriate, may I take more money from you, Mr. or Miss Taxpayer? All right, moving on. In Jim's op-ed, he also talks about what he calls a great deal of misinformation. Thanks to a good deal of misinformation leading up to the May 15th vote, the levy failed by just over 100 votes, putting the district in an extreme financial bind. The blame for failure falls upon the IFF-supported majority. Okay, let's unpack that just a little bit. First of all, he links to something that he says purports, to explain what that misinformation is. But I have seen, perhaps you've noticed this too. Have you seen how often misinformation is how the left-wing ideologues like to refer to truth or inconvenient truths that expose what they're doing or that undermine their argument for why this must be so? I think Jim is engaging in something very similar. But when it fell short by 100 votes, there's just no possible way that in Jim Jones' mind that this could have been perhaps due to the fact that maybe it was a poorly thought out or crappy or ill-timed levy. Maybe the voters had a good reason to say no, but, well, the blame for this failure falls on the IFF-supported majority. In other words, it's all the IFF's fault, as if they are the ones pulling the strings. All right, let's see what else he has to say. He says the tragedy is that the interim superintendent, Susan Lucky, a 2018 distinguished national principal who has spent nearly 4 decades in the district as a teacher and principal, was readily available for the position. Okay, so Jim favors someone who has tenure in the bureaucracy. Many longtime residents of Priest River were greatly distressed about the hiring debacle. Now, he's talking about Brandon Durst, of course, pointing to IFF's track record of fighting against adequate funding for public schools. Now, what he calls adequate funding, again, this is up for interpretation. And is it possible? I'm just asking you this. Is it possible that the school district in question here wasn't able to live within its means? And so throwing more money after, throwing good money after bad maybe wasn't an option. So here's the key. This is what upsets Jim so much. Now that board majority, again supported by IFF, he says has voted to install an unqualified IFF employee as superintendent of West Bonner County School District. Now I think this deserves a little bit of clarification. Brandon Durst is not currently a member of Idaho Freedom Foundation. He did work for them at one point, but he doesn't now. So, a little bit of clarity here, Jim. You're misleading people by not giving them complete facts. So maybe that would be a little more intellectually honest. Just saying. After a three-ring circus of missteps, the majority voted on June 28th to hire Brandon Durst, who Jim calls a problematic person, to say the least. Well, let's have a peek at some of your skeletons, Jim, and see what exactly would make you problematic. I think it depends on who's doing the name calling here. So when someone says, well, he's problematic, if that someone is a rabid left-wing ideologue, I'm actually intrigued here. Okay, well, what is it that makes Brandon problematic? because it could be all the qualities I'm looking for, as in someone who understands what limited government is, someone who understands what fiscal responsibility is, someone who understands that the state should not be the answer to everybody's prayers, including within the education system. So, judging from his track record, says Jim, he is certainly capable of running the school district into the ground. Well, I think any one of us would be. That would be including you too, Jim. But why don't we let him do it before we assign that as the certain outcome which cannot be avoided? I'm sorry, but your fortune-telling skills are about as weak as your rationality and your analytical ability in deciphering, what exactly, Brandon stands for. This would be in keeping with IFF's avowed goal of getting the government out of the business of educating our children. Now, I'm going to ask you a very serious question. Would children still be educated if the government wasn't the primary driver of the public school system? Now, the answer is going to differ from person to person. I'm not insisting you've got to agree with me. But I think it's worth noting that there are people out there, and I don't know, maybe you're one of them, who if we started schooling children as soon as they were infants, it wouldn't take very long before people would say, well, if it weren't for the government schools, these children would never learn to walk. They would just be scooting along on their bellies and crawling for the rest of their lives. So I think sometimes there's a misplaced trust. Now, on the other hand, when you have government-run schools, does it not follow that whoever's cutting the checks, whoever's using the taxpayer money and paying the employees of that system is going to do the very best they can to make sure that the system is favorably portraying whoever is in power? I mean, I'm pretty small government, as little government as possible, as much personal freedom as possible, and yet I would say that would be a reasonable thing to come to. So it's going to teach kids, and it's going to educate kids, or maybe the word should be indoctrinate kids into attitudes that are favorable toward the current power system. And I think this is what gets under Jim Jones' skin. This is why he is so insistent. There is no other reasonable alternative. And frankly, we have to ask ourselves at some point, how good of a job is the current system, the government-run system, doing? And if the answer is, well, we have about 39% literacy, or 39% of students performing, at the proper level of math competency, maybe we should be looking at alternatives. Now, is looking at alternatives the same as destroying? It's not the same thing as saying kids don't deserve any kind of education. But again, my question is, in the absence of the state, which uses force to accomplish its goals, do you really think people would settle for their kids being uneducated? I don't. I think that people would find a way, and frankly, I think you're seeing it all around you. Maybe you just don't recognize it. You'll see homeschooling, you'll see charter schools, you'll see, educational pods. I mean, actually, COVID really kind of blew the doors off for a lot of schools when they closed the schools for such a long time, needlessly at that, but still it was a good thing because parents finally were forced into looking at alternatives. I think this is what Jim Jones, among others, fear, is that people are looking at alternatives and finding out that government-run system, it's really not the cat's meow. So he says that West Bonner County School District patrons are not taking these shenanigans laying down. Now, again, he calls them shenanigans without a whole lot of context, but we're supposed to, I guess, take it on faith. Thus, Jim hath spoken. Now let's all have a glass of Kool-Aid and consider what he has said. Rather, he says they're showing that concerned citizens around the state can fight back against those who would subvert our school system. What about those who would improve it, Jim? Ever given any thought to that? Or is anything that's not maintaining the status quo considered subversive? He says local folks got busy organizing petition drives to recall those board members, Rutledge and Brown. They turned in their petitions at the end of June with more than enough signatures to recall both of the troublesome trustees. Who will rid me of these troublesome trustees? 337 signatures to recall Rutledge. Only 243 were necessary to schedule an election. Brown received 243 recalled signatures, while only 180 were needed. Well, that 243, it sounds like there were 243 true believers. But again, is this really an indication of a problem, or is this just there are enough activists who can game the system that they may force an election come the end of August? Because as I understand it, that's kind of the decision now that if he says if Rutledge and Brown don't step down by August 29th, then they could schedule an election. Well, I hope that's something that they will allow to happen. Let that election carry out. Maybe you'll find out there's far greater support. Now, here Jim fixates on Durst's lack of credentials to serve as superintendent. He does not have the credentials to serve as superintendent and must receive provisional certification from the Idaho Board of Education in order to act in that role. Okay, this comes back to something that I heard some years ago and have come to believe ever stronger ever since, and that is so many of the credentials that people rely upon for advancement in their careers, particularly within academia, are not in any way to be mistaken for certification of competency or merit or achievement. They are badges of compliance. And that's what's sticking in Jim's craw here. Well, Brandon Durst doesn't have these badges of compliance that we need. Okay, so you have to wonder, why then would he enjoy support from, for instance, the school board, or for that matter, from the voters in that particular part of northern Idaho? Well, I think we're supposed to believe, well, it's only those 2 school board members who helped make up, a 3-member majority. That's the only reason. They're forcing him on us when he's entirely not qualified for this. Well, this is where Jim says the rest of us can lend a hand in order to protect West Bonner County School District from further disaster. Well, I'd like to kind of know what are the qualifications for the disaster as of yet. Okay, he hasn't been in office, so whatever's happening right now cannot be laid at the feet of Brandon Durst. So is there a disaster? No? Well, then why don't you give the guy a chance to do what he's going to do rather than simply proclaim that, we've got further disaster ahead of us? I mean, you can't have it both ways. Sorry. This is simple logic. Try to follow along. Idahoans concerned about persons hostile to public schools being given important education positions should make their concerns known to members of the Idaho Board of Education as well as Governor Brad Little. Well, let's appeal to some bigger bureaucrats and see if we can win them over. If the board majority tries to keep Durst without the certification, a patron lawsuit could send him packing. And that's kind of where Jim is going. We've got to get rid of this guy. We've got to stop him at all costs because he's going to ruin everything for us, presumably by not being as big government or as statist in his thinking as those other supporters of the status quo. Now, again, he's saying that like it's a bad thing, like, not supporting the status quo is the kiss of death. But I have to wonder, is that something that may be necessary? Maybe some adjustments are needed. At any rate, give the guy a chance. See if his policies hold water. And I think that's the big fear. They want to get rid of him before he has a chance to show people, hey, there are alternatives to the way we've been doing business as usual. If he can show that can be done, well, it takes the wind right out of the sails of Jim and the other educational statists. By the way, let's talk for a moment about, if Brandon is such an utter failure, if it's so obvious, why would there be so much support for him? Not just from the school board itself, but from supporters within that school district. Now, I know there was a very noisy, little struggle session communist minority that was out there, trying to make their shrill voices heard. But does that really reflect how most people feel? Well, check this out. This is a letter to the editor to the Idaho Tribune. And it's just a quick graphic showing Brandon Durst's support. This was running in the May primary for the state superintendent position. So we're looking at West Bonner County. Brandon is the guy who is represented in red on this pie chart. What do you think of that? That looks like some pretty significant support. So let's see what the letter writer has to say. The letter writer says, just over a year ago, Bonner County voted almost 2-1 to elect Brandon Durst as the Republican nominee for Superintendent of Public Instruction for the entire state of Idaho. Durst won every single precinct in Bonner County with the exception of Beach, Dover, and Washington, which are all located in Sandpoint, not in West Bonner County. Now, the chart that you're seeing here demonstrates that Brandon's margin of victory in West Bonner County was even greater than 2-1, and that's with all 3 of his opponents combined. So if this guy is just some shyster who's, somehow, buffaloed his way in and some flim-flam artist who has fooled people, well, he's done a marvelous job. I mean, that's some undeniably strong voter support. And we're talking thousands and thousands of votes as opposed to the 243 who know what's best and want to get those 2 board members out that supported hiring Brandon as superintendent. Now, the letter writer says, given these facts, it strikes me as funny that the small cadre of last year's Critchfield supporters in West Bonner County could bring themselves to believe that the community wouldn't be absolutely thrilled to have a man that was overwhelmingly thought to be the best qualified to be the superintendent for the whole state of Idaho and dedicate himself to a much-needed turnaround of one of Bonner County's school districts. That seems way out of touch with the community that the Critchfield supporters claim to represent, or just plain unsympathetic to the actual values of Bonner County, and especially the western half of it, or maybe both. That's a good point. In any case, the letter writer, whose name is Anita Arrett, says, I am very thankful that Mr. Durst has decided to dedicate his time and skill set to help us put West Bonner County School District on track towards a much more successful future for the families in the district. Based on the way people voted during the May primary in 2022, I think it's a safe bet to say that residents of West Bonner County feel the same way. Dang. Talk about some inconvenient facts that kind of suck the wind right out of the sails of those. No, anybody but Brandon. Let's go, Brandon. Come on, let's go. Let's see what he can do. Well, now let's talk a little bit about converting us to California. Obviously, there's not enough of that California mindset holding sway up there in the West Bonner County School District. So it looks like His Majesty Gavin Newsome himself was right here in Idaho. Look at those numbers. Wow, he's pulling some Joe Biden-sized crowds. He came to speak in Idaho just a few days ago. And, you'll have to see, there are a couple of pictures here, in particular, Ilana Rubel. Oh my, I've never seen such a look of joy. Gavin says, it's great to be in Boise, Idaho last night supporting the Idaho Democratic Party. Incredibly inspiring to hear about the work they are doing to push back against the GOP and build a bottom-up approach to gain seats in their state house and beyond. Well, isn't that something? Now, I want you to see, look at the smile on her face, that absolute glee. This is Ilana Rubel at the prospect of turning Idaho into California. So, KCRCC says, what do you like about it? The homelessness, the state power to take your kids, high taxes and gas prices, vax mandates? Oh yeah, by all means. Where can I sign up? I mean, I wonder if she got to touch the hem of his garment. That's the kind of ecstatic joy we're seeing. Oh, and some virtue signal points here for Gavin as well, who noted that book bans are at a record high. There have been over 1,200 challenges in the last year, nearly double the then record total from 2021. So he says, I couldn't leave Boise without dropping by this incredible bookstore where the owners of Rediscovered Books are doing everything they can to push back against these insane bans happening across the country. So I guess, again, more of that good California thinking. Your kids can learn all about sex toys and all about exploring their bodies and each other's bodies and all kinds of things that I'm sure would just make you very, very proud. So now we'll talk about how are they going to accomplish this turning Idaho into California. Well, right now, it seems like the focal point is the Open Primaries Initiative. And there's a lot of upset people over the fact that Attorney General Raul Labrador has put a title on this initiative that is a little too truthful for their liking. So here's the take from KTVB. Open primaries in Idaho. The Idaho AG titled the ballot question, and it's not the wording the primary coalition wants. Oh, I can only imagine. It's probably a little too close to the truth. That's why. Here's Idahoans for Open Primaries. Breaking. Attorney General Raul Labrador has dramatically escalated his attacks on our initiative by producing ballot titles that are riddled with falsehoods. We will take Labrador to court, and we have no doubt that we will win. Again, little too much protest there. You might want to switch to decaf. Here's the Idaho Statesman. Now that it's politically convenient, Labrador cares a lot about single subject rule. Not so much when he was a lawmaker. Now, I do have to ask, in interest of fairness, for the Statesman, when he was a lawmaker, was his job to strictly enforce the laws on the books, or was it to create law? And I'm not saying that, therefore, a lawmaker should be dabbling in dishonesty. But I think it's a very different job. So, when you say, well, he didn't really seem to care then, well, if he's trying to get his legislation passed, I'm sure he's trying to do what he can to put the best label forward. And this is the whole beef that the Open Primaries folks are having right now. They're the labels that Labrador has chosen reflect that this is ranked choice voting by any other name. It's what it is. It functions exactly the same. The intent is the same, and it is to basically lose your vote in a sea of unaffiliated voters who have no accountability to the parties in which they're going to be voting, and the primaries in which they're going to be voting. Basically, you appeal to the masses. By the way, the M is silent for a good portion of this, in order to try to get people on the ballot who otherwise would not pass muster if they were held up, say, against a party platform. I do like this comment, though, that was made by a Twitter commenter. Raul Labrador is the main person stopping Idaho from becoming California. That's pretty high praise, and I'm sure it's not an easy job. I also liked the follow-up here. Brian Allman from the Idaho Freedom Foundation says Attorney General Labrador is protecting the Constitution and the people in Idaho from people who are trying to subvert it in service to their own lust for power. That's as accurate a statement as I can think of. It is a lust for power. I think St. Augustine referred to it as libido dominandi. They just want to rule. And this is why when they are denied, having their people, the most experienced and reliable bureaucrats, in the schools, whether it be in the classroom or in the administrative positions, they become furious about it. They can't handle it. They turn into shrill little children who throw temper tantrums and want to hold struggle sessions out in public to try to get people to denounce, their previous beliefs or affiliations, as if no one can ever grow, no one can ever progress or change their mind. It's really something, but it really comes down to power. And what this means is the best way for you and I as voters and just as citizens to determine, who would be the best choice for a given position, or what's the best choice when faced with a particular policy. We have to understand, does this fit within the proper scope of legitimate government? And sometimes the answer is going to be no. And look, for my more conservative-minded viewers, what that means is sometimes, even though it may seem like a good idea, well, of course we should have an amendment to stop flag burning. That's not a very good idea. If it's something that falls outside the scope of government, it's not something that government should be doing. And we shouldn't be trying to figure ways to do end runs around those limitations, because that's how you get bad government. Good government protects your God-given rights. It helps you be secure in your life, your liberty, and your property. It doesn't ruthlessly micromanage every single aspect of your life and tell you what's appropriate to think and teach your kids, all the perversions that are fashionable at the moment. Can you see the difference here? People who want that kind of power are just driven. They believe that only they know what's right. And when someone says no, they accuse those who say no of somehow you're imposing your goodness on us. It's a really interesting dynamic, and I'm sure that psychologists out there will be studying and commenting about this for years. By the way, one final thought, and this is courtesy of Elon Musk. Something that we see a lot is that the use of the term far right. Now, this is particularly true of media here in the great state of Idaho. Elon Musk says traditional media have used the term far right so frequently and hyperbolically that it no longer means anything. What use of that term by media actually represents is the immense ideological gap between the effete elite and the people. Dustin Hurst, by the way, says bingo, and the word extremist in Idaho. So yeah, there are people out there very willing to call names, very willing to portray anything that's outside of, their particular narrow ideology is somehow deeply illegitimate, wrong, disastrous, and it's going to ruin everything. But the subtext that they're not sharing and that we really need to consider is their main concern is it limits their power over you. That's what they find intolerable. That is why they fight so hard to maintain that power. And that's why they want to water your vote down via open primaries rather than having, carefully vetted candidates and well thought out positions that are actually in line with party platforms, as we've seen to this point. Now, again, I'm not a person who believes in political salvation. I don't think there are any political saviors. But the people who want power, they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it and to do whatever it takes to hang on to it. I say those are the kind of people you do not want to give power to in the first place. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our